second. All right, we are good. All right, we are good. We good here, guys?
Go to my end.
All right.
We streaming?
Yes, we are.
We're live. Welcome, everyone. My name's Deemer Class, and we're excited to bring you a new and improved episode of our weekly talk show. We are live on YouTube for the first time. If there are any issues or things coming up along the way, please feel free to drop in the chat. But we're really excited to be here today. We've been doing the weekly talk show for 6 or 7 weeks now, at least. And we're really excited as we start running down the home stretch and, getting in the conference tournament play, previewing, getting into NCAA play in May. And it's been an incredible season so far. So excited for you to join us. Stephen and Matt are joining me. And guys, welcome to today's show.
Thank you. This is my first time ever being live streamed on YouTube, I think. I'm a little nervous. But it's not your two first time because you guys were actually on the cast last night for the BC Cuse game, Little Manning cast. I know it's the second one you guys have done. You did Duke Syracuse men's game in Stephen's old studio in New York. But how did it go? Tell me about it. I wasn't able to watch. I had practice, but seems like it was a great game. How was the cast?
Yeah, quick shout out to Dan Nathan at Risk Reversal Media. You'll see him on CNBC's Fast Money. He is in Spotify's old studios in Chelsea here in New York City. He's let us come by the studio and use it. So big thanks to him there. Last night's game was great. I think a little bit of a longer and more interesting game than the Syracuse Duke men's game. That one was still a great game, but a little bit boring. I think last night we got to see a game go to overtime between Syracuse and BC. This game has been so close in the past couple of years. Two teams that are top in the country, top in the ACC. A lot of just good storylines. So I had a lot of fun last night. Great job by BC overall. And I think these two teams will most likely see each other again sometime soon.
Huge thanks to Dan and Guy and Risk Reversal for letting us use the studio. It was really well done, and just excited to be able to stream something like that live. Awesome game last night. The first one we did was Duke Syracuse, and then we did the Boston College Syracuse game last night. It's 5:00 on ESPNU. Huge overtime win for Boston College. We talked about it on the broadcast, but this game has been so intense and competitive the last couple of years, and BC certainly had the upper hand since Kayla Trainer moved over from Boston College to Syracuse. But you really get a chance to watch some of the best players in the country, and Cuse had a couple goal lead early, and BC chipped away at it, and a lot of great stuff for players and coaches to take away from that matchup.
Definitely. And I think just speaking to the women's game, and we talked a lot about, I feel like Emma Lapinto, but especially Rachel Clark last night, had a quiet first half along with McKenna Davis. They were both, I think, held scoreless in the first half, but looking at the stats right now, Rachel Clark finishes that game 3-1, McKenna Davis 0-3. I think they were huge to just get that BC offense going. And then Cassidy Weeks, she ends up scoring the game winner. I feel like she's been there for forever, is still somehow, I feel like, kind of underrated. She finishes the game 3-1 and made a lot of plays in between the lines. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to them as well.
How do you guys feel though, just from a logistical standpoint, like watching the game, casting it, is it pretty seamless, you feel like, from the studio?
I think so. I think the one thing that it's kind of hard to get a feel on is what's the lag time between the game and what we're talking about. We're still trying to seek some of that feedback. I think if you were to look back on it, like, hearing the game, hearing us talk about the game, if you're rewatching it, like, it's probably another good way to just kind of hear some of the ins and outs and analysis. But I feel like Stephen and I had solid flow between being able to talk about what's actually happening and weaving in some other things that were coming up, obviously like what we're trying to do here with the talk show.
Yeah, cool. Well, hopefully we can keep knocking on that door and find a way to get a live broadcast the game. But that's pretty cool. I think second one we've done once again. Pretty cool. We were able to do that. We were talking this week. I know we've talked the last 2 weeks, but now that we're on YouTube here and maybe a little bit of a wider audience, hitting some of the same topics. But one that's been continuously coming up is the Tour Time debate. And the Tour Time just released the top 25 nominees for men's and women's Tour Time finalists for 2024. And I know we've been talking about this off the record a little bit. Guys, any thoughts, reactions to the list that just came out?
Yeah, definitely. I think last week I was highlighting that Peyton Cormier was not on the tour and watch list. This is a guy who will most likely break the all-time Division I scoring record. He may finish top 2, top 3. Is not on that list. And I think taking a look at the broader list before they narrowed it down, pretty laughable that he's not on it. And then I think to still keep him off is pretty tough, in my opinion, on the men's side. And then on the women's side, we talked about this a lot last night. McKenna Davis, the quarterback of the BC offense, she was left off the list as well. BC had 3 representatives. So 2 snubs. I know not to take anything away from any of the top 25 players on either side. I think everyone is definitely very well deserving. And I know that only 25 can make it, but I think leaving those 2 off was a little bit head scratching. And then just taking a look, 2 sophomores on the list combined between men's and women's. Madison Taylor from Northwestern, Joey Spallina from Syracuse was another thing that stood out for me.
I'll echo the McKenna Davis snub and the Cormier snub. I agree with both. I think, and it brings up an interesting point. I was catching up with Joe Spallina recently, and we were talking about, if you're not a number 1 guy, or girl, if you're a number 2, quote unquote, player, like, does that hurt you, when it comes to these kind of decisions? And I think it does, but I think wrongfully so. I think that people need to dig in. The committee needs to dig in to how these teams are actually facilitating offense. And that's why I think, one, Cormier, for any of the list, not even just top 25, but like you said, just top 70, that's a joke. He's finishing a majority of Schellenberger's assists. He's been doing it to score over 200 goals in his career. He's going to finish top 5 all time in goals scored. That's crazy to me, especially knowing that the committees tend to give lifetime awards to players over the years. And then on the BC side, I think it's even more crazy. When you watch that game last night, you see how many scoring opportunities McKenna Davis is responsible for, assist opportunities in the Boston College offense. To not have her when she's top 5 in the country in assists against the competition week in, week out they play, that's crazy to me.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about the last time a 2, got recognized, it was Lyle and Miles, right, in a pair award. But Deemer, if you extrapolate that, like, where do you draw the line then on a defender? Because every year, you talk about number 1 offensively, but you kind of, it's like almost a ceremonial thing just to put defenders on this list, when how seriously can you actually consider a defender, unless that becomes a Final Four team where there's like a Costabile-esque like face-off goal scorer, that team's winning, barely giving up goals type of thing. And you see it across all sports, right? Heisman in football, it's almost like a quarterback every year. So I understand your point, but can you realistically actually, value a guy that's not a Pat Cavanaugh, a Connor Schellenberger, a Brendan O'Neill, Brandau, Malone's putting up a ton of points, Spallina's putting up a ton of points. I get putting these guys on the list, but I think it'd be pretty hard, even as like a defender, to make a case for one of those guys that isn't a number 1. If you did, and I think, Ajax is the best defender in college lacrosse. If he won the Tour Time, people would be like, what the hell? Unfortunately, if Cormier was up there, people would be like, well, Schellenberger, because Cormier's, I just think it's I guess a little annoying that it's always the number 1, but I can't really see a real world where it can't be the number 1 offensive guy for the Tour Time.
I don't think that I think you're right in that the number one should be winning it, but I think the number two can be recognized either in the top 25 or as a finalist in the top five. You look at, I feel like on the women's side, we can see it last year, Northwestern, Izzy Skane, and Erin Kuykendall. Just seeing the two of them, I think Izzy Skane is the number one, and she's the one that comes away with the trophy. But also, shout out to the committee for recognizing that they have more than just one player and more than one player that's driving that offense.
Well, that's, I think, the issue at hand is, Northwestern, for example, gets three attackers in the top 25: Skane, Taylor, Kuykendall. And Taylor's had an incredible year, but she's theoretically being covered by the third defender. So why should she be penalized because she's been a complete force in leading the team in points, because everyone's saying that she's covered by not the top defender? We also, I just think the case, and I don't disagree, I think the offensive number 2 and 3 is a little different of apples to oranges compared to like a defensive number 2 and 3, in my opinion, because I think offensive 2 and 3 production can still be evaluated. But then I think the surface level of, fandom and people need to also start digging a little deeper in terms of understanding like the actual impact on offense and defense. So I think both sides need to improve, but not just for Tawarton, for All-American awards, all conference. And obviously some of that coaches have a chance to vote on. I don't know how the Tawarton committee works with that. So, I need to get more educated there, but that's just how I think our sport needs to evolve in terms of what people are placing value on.
Yeah, and I think just speaking with Northwestern having three attackers, I think Northwestern, number one team in the country. And if you sit down and watch their games, there's no way you can really walk away and say that those three aren't at least in the top 25 best players in the country. But I see what you're saying. And I think especially just going back to a Cormier, he's an inside finisher. And I think those guys always fail to get recognized. You look at like a Jake Taylor, he's never going to get recognized as much as a Kavanaugh's. And whether that's right or wrong, it just is kind of the way that it unfolds. But Deemer, you talk about it. It's like if Schellenberger is up there, the first person that he would probably thank if he wins is going to be a guy like Cormier, right? Because his game doesn't exist without the other. But it's a topic to keep watching.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously like a broader topic, maybe a little less realistic and one just to talk about. But I think the more realistic one is when you narrow it down to the top guys. I think there's more of a debate on, okay, we were talking about this, getting penalized because you play a less competitive schedule. So these Ivy League guys, maybe a TJ Malone in the versus a, Schellenberger, Kavanaugh, O'Neal, even a Spallina that's playing an ACC schedule. But you look at point production versus kind of that anecdotal, just like value to a really good team. Like what Schellenberger does for UVA, he's putting up a lot of points, but Brandau's putting up like absurd points. And so you look at that, how do you value, you don't want to penalize Matt for playing for Yale, but they're playing a tough schedule, but not quite the same as what UVA is facing, day in and day out with the ACC. So that conversation, I think it's a little tougher than the one we're just talking about of how do you look at those top five, probably the top five guys on the list and distinguish between, who really is the Tawarton candidate, finalist, best player in the country.
Yeah, I think you're certainly framing it in a great way. And I think it comes back to, for me, that also brings back like the Jordan Wolf, Lyle, and Miles Thompson situation. And obviously I'm biased on that one, but you're going to, again, like you had someone in, two guys in the conference that is not as competitive and don't make it as far versus someone who had a high 90-point season and, led his team to a national championship, so you kind of have that same debate there. And that's where I think, in my opinion, if we're going to do that 10 years ago, then like I'm also, that's why I am in the Brandau fan camp right now. Like I think the outsized production he's had, the multiple 10+ point games, the still big time performances against most teams except for Penn State on their schedule, to me, warrants that if Brandow pushes his team to the final four, he has to be seriously considered. And I think, again, he's pushing to be a front runner, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll take the other side of that. And it's funny that you're referencing the Jordan Wolf and Lyle Miles Thompson. I am one of, if not the biggest Lyle Thompson fan, just grew up watching him play and think he's fantastic. But I think when you look back at that year, 2014, Jordan Wolf just won his second national championship. He actually had over 100 points that season. He was the first player in ACC history to ever do so. I think when you look at the body of work and the teams that he played and what he did with his team, I think that actually is how I'm comparing kind of the Schellenberger versus Brandow. You could also have it be Schellenberger and Kavanaugh. I think they're really 1A and 1B right now, both averaging 4.7-ish points per game. But when I look at Connor Schellenberger, just a couple things stand out. We can also talk about if this is a career award or if it's a season award. But just looking at this season, I think he is a true quarterback of this offense. There's a ton of talent around him. And I think when you play, and I'm not saying that Yale isn't talented, but when you look at Virginia's top 6, top 9 versus Yale's top 6 or top 9, I think you see that the ball has to be in more sticks. There's only one ball on the Virginia offense. So maybe touches aren't coming around as much as, say, a guy like Brandow has. I think also just looking at the way that he does play the game, I don't know how much it comes into context, but I think Schellenberger, whether he's working from above the cage, behind the cage, I think he's so versatile as a Dodger. And I think he's just a great overall attackman. And then when you look at just the schedule that Virginia plays, looking right now at the top 6 teams in men's Division I, just pulling this up, it's Notre Dame's ranked 1, Duke 2, Hopkins 3, Virginia 4, Maryland 5, Syracuse 6. So obviously Virginia's in that top 6. They play every single team that's in that top 6. And Yale does not play any of those teams. Yale's biggest game right now was against Denver, who's ranked number 7, and Yale's ranked number 8. So I think just when you're looking at strength of schedule, that would be kind of my argument for Schellenberger or a guy like Pat Kavanaugh in the ACC.
I actually have an interesting thing I heard yesterday about Yale. Coach Pressler was talking to Coach Shea at Yale about, catching up some PLL stuff. And he mentioned that Coach Shea said they are down 8 or 9 starters due to injury. And they have 2 losses, and you just said number 8, Stephen. And he told Coach Pressler it's been the most rewarding season, or one of them as a coach, because their next man up mentality has been phenomenal. And obviously there's a million factors you can put into this stuff and strength of schedule, but for Yale to be down 8 starters, to be having this level of success, largely carried by Matt Brandow, that could be, it's just another factor to look into it. A really interesting take on a guy. It's not his fault the schedule they're playing. And he's doing the absolute most he can be doing right now. And I think that's something worth factoring in when you really dive into it. I think at the end of the day, though, and we know this, so we're having the conversation now to have the conversation. At the end of the day, it's going to be largely impacted by the postseason. So say what you want now, but what these guys do over the next, 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks is really going to win the award for somebody.
I would say also, if we're going to look at the rest of the candidates, let's take a quick look at Pat Kavanaugh. Pat Kavanaugh is still like in that mid to high 4 points a game. They've played less games. His overall point numbers are lower. But again, I don't think Pat Kavanaugh should be docked that Notre Dame's not playing as many games. They could play a couple more, and he could have another 25 points to his name by going, 3 8-point games. And then you'd be like, Pat Kavanaugh, boom, up and away. So, to me, you're going to look at Pat Kavanaugh's body of work, and if they make a run and he goes crazy, ACC tournament and then beyond, and then NCAAs, you're going to throw out the points or what the actual numbers are and the emotions of, hey, his impact, and he stirs the entire Notre Dame offense. That's what you're going to, think about. So on the flip side, just because Brandow has a lot of points and then we're trying to pick apart his schedule, to Matt's point, like the effort and the performances that he's putting on with so many guys that were in their, preseason lineup out and then still dominating against good teams, I think you have to seriously consider him. And I would disagree with you, Stephen, around this notion of Schellenberger not having the ball in his stick that much. He took 13 shots against Michigan, to start the season. So I think the offense runs through him. Every high wing dodge that they initiate is designed to then get the ball to him at X, so then someone can go pick for him.
No, there's no slander to Brandau here. I think he should definitely be a finalist, but I do think there are way more mouths to feed on the Virginia roster, top to bottom in the top 9. And I think that does factor into things. I think similarly, I think if you put Jordan Wolf on the Albany roster in 2014, I think he could have, I think Lyle finished with 128 points. Wolf finished with 103, I believe. I think Wolf definitely could get up there and be towards 130 the same way Lyle was. So I think it comes into play there with you have a really talented roster. You have All-Americans up and down. And I think that can make it harder to even get a lot more points. But especially with the schedule, and I do like your Pat Cavanaugh comment, it's not his fault that Corrigan doesn't schedule any cupcake games. They had like a random bye week in the middle of the year. They always play fewer games than most programs. But also, it's April 19th. There's so much lacrosse left to play. The games that we're going to remember are going to be the games that are happening in the future from right now. And these guys are going to have the chance. I think Yale's going to make the tournament. I think Virginia and Notre Dame are basically locked to make the tournament. Obviously, you can't forget or look past Brendan O'Neill. I feel like he's flipped the script on his season from last week's performance against Virginia. He looked a little bit healthier, a little bit more bouncy. So we'll see how that goes. And then obviously you got Kirst. And then we'll see if anyone else kind of can stick themselves out here. I'm very high on TJ Malone's game, among others. So it'll be a fun race. And I think just a broader conversation there's a lot of great talent out there and there's a lot of great teams out there. So a lot of parity going into the final stretch.
I think if I had to make a guess, I think Schellenberger will win it. I think Pat Cavanaugh is the most impactful player in Division I lacrosse on the team right now, though. I think just across the board, if Pat Cavanaugh gets hurt, I don't know what Notre Dame is. And I just mean that they'll be good, but what he brings to that team from an energy standpoint, a riding standpoint, goal scoring, an unassisted goal scorer against some of the best players in the country, a feeder, an off-ball scorer. I think he is probably a healthy Pat Cavanaugh is the most impactful player to what probably is the best team in college lacrosse right now. So that's kind of my take. I would, if you guys don't mind, want to do a quick hit just because I think when you only talk about the Tewaaraton, you're leaving out some of the best players, is talk about the Schmeisser Award real quick, which is the best defender in lacrosse. Because although the Tewaaraton's not labeled this, it is essentially the best offensive player in lacrosse, just kind of the way it works. And so for defenders, when you look at the Schmeisser list, that is really, the Tewaaraton for defenders. And there's four guys on the Tewaaraton list that are defenders right now. Kastner, Ajax, Kenny Brower, and Pacino. All deserving to be there, I would say. In my opinion, when you narrow that down and you look at who were probably the Schmeisser finalists, you're looking at Ajax and Pacino. I think Pacino's come onto the map as just like an absolute dominant LSM against some really good teams in scoring goals, ground balls, transition, but also playing the ball well and flashy checks. But I think Ajax has been the standout number one cover guy in college lacrosse for probably more than a year now. And so I think that's just an interesting, at least for me selfishly, but maybe some people that, watch as an interesting defensive side of it, that Schmeisser conversation becomes one that I do think gets pretty interesting between a few of those guys.
Does that, out of curiosity, and I'll give a quick shout out to Big Mike Earhart, who recently retired, and I think since the inception of the PLL, might have won most of, if not all of,
5 for 5
LSM, awards of the year. How much, when you're looking at the Schmeisser Award, like how much are you factoring in like LSM play? Because that's obviously a huge part of Pacino's game versus like being the best defender.
That's a great question. I think it's a lot like the vagueness of the tour time between some of these different players. It's the most outstanding defenseman in men's college lacrosse, but there's not an award. There's not an award for most outstanding LSM. Although I do believe Joel White won midfielder of the year as an LSM at Syracuse. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was just gonna say this. I think Paceno, the LSM from Albany, I think he's more in the conversation for midfielder of the year for me. I think looking at the Tour top 25 list, there's only 2 midfielders that are listed on that. Joel White won that award, I believe, in 2010 and 2011 as midfielder of the year. And if I'm not mistaken, Jared Connors, I believe, won midfielder of the year in either, I believe, 2021. So I think that's an award that Paceno could be in. I think when you look at just pure best defenders, I think Ajax would be 1, and then I would put Kenny Brower at 2, just for their defensive play and their body of work thus far this season.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't have any qualms with that. And I think I think Zappatello is elite, and I do think that makes sense around Pacino being more of in the conversation for midfielder of the year. I think from a midfield perspective, it does seem like this year kind of lacks the star power. Knobloch has continued to make waves for Rutgers, but because they haven't been able to land any signature wins, I think some of those performances get muted. And then I think when you look at the ACC, I think like if you just kind of go through the list quick, and then even some Big Ten like Maryland, Duke, Virginia, and Cuse, a lot of really talented midfielders, but no one's like grabbing the dominant midfielder cup and hoisting it, and I think that's where Pacino is probably the favorite for that.
I'm looking at it now. Joel White won 2010. CJ Costabile won 2012. Schreiber 13 and 14. Trevor Baptiste won 2017, 2018. Zach Goodrich won 2019. Jared Connors won 2021. So it's actually like a pretty healthy share of defensive LSMs or defensive midfielders or face-off guys to win that award. So that being said, I actually think Pacino, to that point, is a very high likelihood of winning midfielder of the year, which to then leaves Ajax, I think, obvious front runner for Schmeisser.
I don't think we need more awards, but I do think it's worth the College Lacrosse Committee adding a like specialty award, because I think like if you're trying to compare like an offensive midfielder to a D midfielder to a face-off guy to an LSM, like it's all about how you assess the value. And obviously you could just do like most dominant, impactful person, but like,
well, isn't that first team All-American? There's only one goalie and one face-off guy that get it, right? And I know you're talking award, but especially the specialty positions, like if you're getting first team All-American as a goalie, like it's one thing to get as a midfielder or attackman, which is still in defender. It's hard, but I mean, I guess if you want an award for it, but for me, it's like everybody kind of knows, like if you're a first team All-American goalie, like you were the guy.
Is who does the like goalie of the year? Like, is that the coaches committee? Like that also is doing the coaches Division I All-Americans?
That's a good question. That was a good question.
That would be probably just my only thing would just be like, yes, I agree with you. I think being a like coaches All-American like is probably the highest like All-American type honor, because I think those are the guys voting on that are most in tune and all that, versus like just press or a random awards committee when it comes to like All-American.
Yeah, agreed. I always thought that was just like the gold standard. Like if you got when those All-Americans came out, to me that was like the list, and sometimes disagreed with it, but like that was such an honor to be on that list as an All-American.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just with who's, like you guys are saying, with who's voting on it, it does become very important. Moving on here, just topics wise, Deemer, you did have a tweet out this week, and this kind of ties into we had a good conversation earlier this spring just on lacrosse social media, and I know that's a huge topic, and there's a lot to unpack there. Deemer, you did have a really good tweet out this week. You said if you are forcing your shooters to only shoot low, you are doing them a major disservice, regardless of their age. Would love to know kind of what forced you to maybe tweet that and just your thoughts around it. I definitely have some thoughts of my own, and just in terms of how to coach stuff like that.
Yeah, I can't remember which day this week I tweeted it, and I can't remember what prompted me to do so, but it was one of those, I know, quick plug to Matt's random defensive thoughts of the week. I would say that probably fell under one of my random offensive thoughts. And, it's just something that comes up a lot. And, I've been working with a lot of athletes this spring who, again, across levels, and we've written about it a few times in our weekly thoughts, where again, like athletes are, having different levels of struggles with playing time, communicating with their coaches, trying to approach those situations, build confidence on the field. And I think it just kind of kept falling in that line. I think for me, like in our sport, it's a creative game. There's a lot of ways to do things. I certainly myself have guardrails and things that I believe to be true. But also the more I coach and the more players I've worked with, if you limit people to just one way of doing things, that one size fits all doesn't always help, and I think when it comes to shooting, if you're telling people you can only shoot to one spot, it just becomes so predictable. And I just think when you break it down and you hear a lot of youth coaches and rhetoric, everyone's yelling, shoot low, put it here. And when you watch goals go in, and we talked about it last night, goals are going in stick side high, goals are going off stick, high to high, high to low, low to high, low to low, and it's about being deceptive and being able to pick your spots. And I just think from a coaching perspective, it's frustrating when it looks like you shoot high to high and you get saved. But if you only shoot high to low, or you only shoot low inside, like you become scouted, at the highest levels, and you make it obvious where you're going.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you said deception. I think if you see a player that's they're shooting high to high, I think instead of being like shoot low, you can just say you need to work on your deception, right? You need to make this goalie think that you're going elsewhere. Because that's really what it comes down to, whether you're going high to low, low to high, high to high, low to low, like they're all great shots in their own right. And I also think people just have different preferences. People have different skill sets. Even offensive players, and people don't always talk about this, but players' sticks are strung really differently. Like my stick is going to be strung very differently than say Ryan Brown's stick. The ball is going to come out a different way. So it can be harder to shoot certain shots with one stick than it would be another. And I think that has a big impact on the way that people shoot. But I think just in terms of coaching it, got to let the players find what works for them and what they're good at. And I'm happy you tweeted it, and I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think it's a really good point, and I think it's bigger than just this point. It's a great example, and I mentioned something a little while ago about like defensive misconceptions, like don't cross your feet or whatever. I just think there's, as coaches, you want control and to give absolutes to your players, like rules of things to do. But the game is so gray. There's so many moving parts. There's so many dynamics. To say never shoot, high is not the answer. But then for Deemer's point, the reverse is your answer is not to say, oh, you should shoot high. The answer is not shooting low. It's deception, right? It's this principle of being able to navigate the gray. And it's this like word I've really started to like a lot in coaching, anti-fragile, right? If you're like only shoot low and that ball keeps getting safe, well, that's pretty fragile, because like then if you're not scoring low, well, the kid, I was taught all I know is now to shoot low, but it's not working, right? A principle of deception learns, well, the goalie's dipping, and so you learn with deception how to move them and score. And that takes a little bit of power away from the coach. But the truth is, and I think we all know this to be true, lacrosse is a player's game, without a doubt, on game day. You can't orchestrate the whole thing. Sometimes coaches try to. In football, you can do that. In lacrosse, you have to give them confidence, skills, rules of thumb, and principles, maybe more than like absolutes. And I think, to your point, Deemer, that tweet, it's just opening the conversation of empowering kids to play better in the gray than to try to give them these absolutes that were taught with the right intentions at first. You teach young players shoot low because at first they probably throw it right to the goalie stick. But we have to make sure that we're responsible enough as players get better to change the narrative on what you're actually teaching them.
Yeah, I like the anti-fragile reference a lot. Brian McCormick, I think, is someone too that I feel like is always playing devil's advocate when it comes to coaching and development. And so I feel like they're like sociological constructs, when it comes to like society and what we think is hard work and how hard work is achieved, just all these different things. Like I just find his perspective to be really interesting. And, I thought back to like when you're talking about gray area, Matt, Coach Caputo at Duke, once we initiated our offense, he always used to preach playing in the grays. It was the idea of once you kind of got that initial trigger and got that action going, then you're playing in that gray area, that in between where it's not scripted. It's not something that you can just play, so you have to learn to play. And Coach D always talks about just being a ball player, be a lacrosse player. And I think we all want that. We all say we want that. But as a coach, how you preach it and how you live it and how you communicate to your players either reinforces that and builds that, or it detracts from that based on the cues that you use and how you correct people and cue people.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And it's funny, I'm reading Brian McCormick's book, Anti-Fragile Defense. It's awesome. I was messaging him on Twitter. I'm actually going to connect with him in the next week or so, because I was just like, this is exactly what the principles for lacrosse. And so that's a huge one. And I think it's like, you see a lot of coaches, like we had a kid, one of our best players the other night, slide maybe at a bad time, and it got slide at a bad time, and it got passed to his guy, and we didn't rotate into it. But he was sliding to double, so it was an opportunistic play. I'm not going to get mad at him for the slide. I'm talking to our defense. I was like, guys, we can't be so fragile that one of our players looks to make a play, slides at a bad time, and the next pass is a goal. Like, that's just like I can't tell you when and when not to slide. We can get better at it, but we have to be so connected and principle wise in tune with one another that we can't break down because of that play. And you think in the past, maybe you'd be like, hey, that's a bad slide. And that confuses players because then next time he doesn't slide. So it's a great conversation, Deemer. I love that point. But I think that's something just relates to me because I'm trying to embody that in my coaching, and it's hard at times, but it's less absolutes, more guidance and rules of thumbs, and building this like anti-fragility, if you will, towards that.
Definitely. I think you guys are spot on. I think it's a great topic, great conversation. We're about 40 minutes in here. If you guys don't mind moving on here to some previews of this upcoming weekend's games. It's rivalry week kind of throughout men's college lacrosse. I have two games that I'd love to preview. Virginia at Syracuse Saturday, 2 p.m. on ESPNU, and then Maryland at Hopkins Saturday, 4 p.m. on ESPNU. Starting with this Syracuse-Virginia game. Syracuse, number 2 in the ACC right now. UVA is number 3. Syracuse is 10-4. Their past couple of games, so that crazy Cornell loss that they had, and then they beat UNC by 1. They were up, I believe, 10-4, and they won the game 10-9. I think they went through. They didn't score for the last 20 or so minutes of the game. So they're just need to look going into this weekend just to finish games better and have some stronger fourth quarters. And then looking at UVA, they just lost another game to Duke in the regular season. I believe I saw a tweet yesterday that said it might be 20 years now that UVA hasn't beaten Duke in the regular season. It's between 18 and 20 years. So UVA is going to be coming, looking to rebound. Their 12 goals against Duke was UVA's offenses. It was their lowest scoring output this season. And also from looking at that UVA and Duke game, Nunes was pulled very early. I believe Duke scored 7 goals without Nunes making a save, and they ended up pulling him. So definitely a heated rivalry between these two. I think it's always a really up and down, fast-paced game. We were talking about it a little bit on the broadcast last night. If in these big ACC games, and it can also be Big Ten games, but I feel like there's more opportunity and more chance to take risk. So if you're an attackman, maybe forcing a feed because the ball is probably going to be coming back to you, just with the up and down tendency that both of these programs play with, especially when they play one another. So really looking forward to this one. I think it should be a great game and a huge crowd.
I think, I saw in the box score last year, and I assume that Kastner covered Spallina. I think Spallina was 0-2 last year on 5 shots, and Virginia won 19-12. I'm intrigued to see that matchup again this year. You talk about Stephen, Cuse starting to, be able to close out these games. Again, I think, everyone realizes how much talent and how dangerous they can be. And I think it's just part of their growth curve for, playing against a lot of veteran teams in the conference. But I'm excited to see. So, again, I think too, if Cuse can get firing early and stick a couple on Nunes, I think that's going to be an interesting storyline to watch based on, how that went for him against Duke. So I think that's probably their game plan. If Hiltz can get hot, if you can fire a couple step downs and beat him early, that's going to be one of the, I think, recipes to success for Syracuse.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I think, Stephen, your points were spot on. For Syracuse, it's the ability they've shown, in the Duke game, what they're capable of at times. I think Virginia is, obviously as formidable opponent as anybody, but for them as a younger team, especially defensively, the UNC kind of game shows, can they close games down the stretch, which is going to be an extremely meaningful skill as a team to develop at this point of the season. So talent-wise, it can go. I think UVA has the edge, but Syracuse is there in the ballpark. But really, it's going to be about execution from a younger defense with Syracuse.
Matt, speaking of that, how do you think that Syracuse should mark up matchup-wise? Does it make sense to put Dwan on McCabe? Does it make sense, with the success that Bill had against Brennan, to put him on a righty Schellenberger, or kind of change up that matchup? How do you think about that?
I think that if I could guess, I think they'll do Figueres on Schellenberger. Figueres has been covering the predominant, X guy, ball carrier, the Erxes of the world. I think they'll match up there, and then I think I would guess Dwan on McCabe. I think a lefty on McCabe as a righty is a nice move. That would be my guess. Coach Oderna knows those guys and was watching way more film on this game than I am. But if I could bet, Figueres will start on Schellenberger and Bill will start on McCabe.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. I'm interested to see. I think this will be a big game for the Syracuse midfield. They have 2 really talented lines, and I think Spallina and Hiltz, Muley, I think they're all fantastic players. I think it'll be interesting to look out there. I don't know if any of those guys are over 5'10" on the Syracuse attack, and I think all 3 of the UVA starting defenders are over 6'5". I think just that'll be a fun storyline to watch. And then I think just with Syracuse's midfield dodgers, I think between Michael Leo, Sam English, Finn Thompson, Luke Roa, you saw him have an explosive game against Maryland. Look for those guys to have great games. And we'll also see, I'm assuming, a lot of 2-man, a lot of picks, trying to get Spallina and Hiltz free there. Also, shout out, Paul Gate is getting his jersey retired at Syracuse. One of the greatest players of all time. I believe he's a 3-time first-team All-American. Obviously, I think he gets overshadowed a little bit by brother Gary in 22 living on at Syracuse, but Paul, fantastic player. And I think he's the 3rd person for the Syracuse men's lacrosse program to be getting his jersey retired behind Gary Gate and Mikey Powell. So that should be an awesome weekend. It's alumni weekend up there. Unfortunately, I won't be there, but I know they're trying to pack the dome.
I'm happy to take your spot if you need a replacement lefty.
Go ahead. Go ahead. All
I can
right.
show everyone how to celebrate after a goal.
Yeah, we know you're known for your great celebrations.
That you think are dope.
I did at the time.
At the time, he says.
At the time, and now he's like, oh shit, he actually wasn't planning to make it dope, so I don't think it's dope anymore.
Yeah, it'd be cooler if you owned it, but you're like, I don't think you love that you did it.
Oh, I thought you said that you thought we're dumb. That would have been better. And then Steven said at the time, as if he didn't think they were dumb anymore. Now that we're like on the call together.
No, I liked it. I think I was in high school when I saw you do that.
Deemer's old.
I wasn't saying it like that, but anyways, another big rivalry game, Maryland at Hopkins Saturday, 4 p.m. on ESPNU. I read this morning that the last time this game, so 2 years ago, Maryland at Hopkins, Maryland won 22-7, which is wild. I think that was Maryland's undefeated, phenomenal, one of the best teams ever years, but wild stat. But then looking at this game, Hopkins #1 in the Big Ten right now, Maryland #2. I think those are both locked in for the Big Ten tournament. Taking a look at Hopkins recently, they're 9-3. They've had 2 huge come from behind wins and overtime games. Collison on Hopkins has back-to-back weeks of overtime game winners. He's got to be feeling good. And I think it just shows Hopkins is doing a really good job of finishing games down the stretch. I watched them really closely when they played Syracuse earlier this year, and they were trailing Syracuse, but they had a good and strong fourth quarter. So will be fun to watch. And I think Maryland, we kind of all know what Maryland does and what Maryland brings. They have 3 straight wins right now. They're 3-1 in conference play. I wrote this in our notes, how I feel like people were counting them out in that first half against Penn State. And I saw someone tweet like Tillman's never lost 3 games in a row, and people are thinking Maryland's down, but I think Maryland is doing just fine, but excited for this one.
Yeah, I forgot that was only 2 years ago. I remember watching that game of the Hop Maryland, and that was Maryland's best season. Hopkins, like, what a resilient bounce back for that program, because they were really kind of down and out for a couple of years. But now I think it's back to, maybe what it was for a while, except maybe with 4 more goals each, because it used to be like 7-6 games and 6-5 games. And I think we lost 7-4 one time to Hopkins at home, which is the worst game ever. But now both offenses are a little more balanced, plus the shot clock. But I think you look at both these teams and you kind of flip. In my eyes, neither of them are like Duke, Virginia, Notre Dame, but they're both right there in more of this, like, not as many, really big A-list name guys, but just like gritty wins. They kind of play pretty good team ball. They show resiliency. They're kind of winning, like Maryland against Penn State, really just kind of gutsy plays down the stretch and not giving up. Hopkins has had a number of those grind out games against teams that maybe they should have beaten by more, air quotes should have. We all know how competitive it is. So they're both teams that I think they don't pop off the page like talent wise with any specific guy like some of those other ACC teams do, but they've both shown resiliency to battle through coming back, finishing games. And given that nature of how both their seasons are going right now, and the fact that it's a Maryland Hopkins game, I expect this game to be, 1, a bloodbath, but 2, really close and down to the wire, where you'll see momentum swings most likely, and some big plays being made down the stretch by probably, not the biggest of name guys.
I think there's a lot of interesting storylines here too. I think one, and again, I'm not close to it, because they're not my alma maters, but if you're Hopkins, like, you're still pissed about that game when Maryland like pumped you for like 20 some goals, so like, I think that stings and sits with a few guys. I think there's probably a few guys still on that roster, and I think about even just dynamics of a conference. Maryland's been kind of sitting at the throne the last few years. We saw a couple weeks ago, Penn State was making a push, and then they gave up that comeback And then now, again, Maryland's still undefeated or one loss against Penn State. This is Hopkins' year in recent years to knock off Maryland. But it's going to be really tough. Both teams are really well coached. But I do really like for Hopkins. And again, like, I don't know, Stephen, like, I know Degnan did not, but did Angelus make the top 25 watch list or top 25 nominees for Toward?
I don't think he did.
I think those are two guys that are pivotal to Hopkins' success this year. And as a top 5 team, again, like, those are two other guys that you could make a push. I think Degnan's scored a goal in 51 of the last 52 games. And he's one of the big time shooters. So he's, again, even when we're talking about, we overlooked him when we're talking about midfielders, he's had a really impressive year as a midi as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the only player that Hopkins has on the list right now is, and that will be, is Chase Ireland making the top 25. Hopkins, their goalie. I feel like all year we've kind of been talking about Angelus. I think Melendez was the headliner coming into the season. I think he's on the cover of Inside Lacrosse with Joey Spalina. And I think we've been saying, well, Angelus is really Hopkins' guy that they're going through. He's their quarterback. He had a really strong start to the season. He's leading the team right now with 52 points on 20 goals and 32 assists. And then Degnan, I feel like, once again, he's been here for a long time and he's just been super consistent. I think there's some stat. I think he's the longest active goal scorer, like, from each game, the streak that he has, having at least one goal per game. But looking at him right now, he's got 37 goals, 5 assists. So I'm pretty surprised that neither one of them was on that list. And that's with Hopkins being ranked number 3 in the country right now. They didn't get anyone other than a goalie on the list. But I think we dove enough into our thoughts on the tour and nominations for right now.
But to that point, and now that we dive into it, Maryland's kind of the same way, right, with Ajax and Weirman. Just kind of highlighting, they don't have a lot of guys that are like the guy, but they're solid. And I just think that makes them fun to watch because you don't really know who's going to step up. They play good team lacrosse a lot, where multiple scores, multiple ways of scoring, transition, offense to defense, face off. So I think it's the similar team dynamics of how they're being successful right now.
Yeah, and with Maryland, I mean, I would be shocked. I know I'm really high on his game. Braden Erickson, he's only a sophomore right now. I would be pretty surprised. I think he'll definitely be a top 25 semifinalist by the end of his career, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him be an eventual top 5 finalist by the time his career is done in College Park. I think he has a good case to be the next number 1, and I think he's just a super dynamic attackman and one of the toughest one-on-one matchups in the country.
You're here. Cool.
On the women's side, we can just touch it quickly. Deemer, I know you're close to this game with Northwestern women at Michigan. We've been talking all year about the Big Ten, and I think this is the strongest year they've had top to bottom, and there's been a lot of parity. We saw Penn State beat Hopkins yesterday. So Northwestern at Michigan, Sunday noon on the Big Ten Network. I don't know if Michigan has ever beaten Northwestern. My guess would be that they have not. I think Northwestern right now, they are still holding that number 1 spot, both nationally, but in the Big Ten. Penn State was able to knock them off within the Big Ten. So I know Michigan's going to be looking to do the same and is having one of their best years yet.
Yeah, I don't know if they've ever beaten Northwestern. I would guess maybe once, but it could be never. The team wasn't very strong before Hannah Nielsen got there, and I think since she's been there, Northwestern's been kind of really rising up to their old levels of dominance. I think this has been a historic team so far for Michigan. I think they've had some wins this year that and comebacks this year that they haven't had in the past. Most recently against Hopkins, coming down from a 4-goal halftime deficit. So I think, of the years past, I think this is the year that Michigan is poised to be able to to get that win, but it's a top 5 matchup. So it's just going to be one of those really exciting games. And, Northwestern has a ton of weapons. Sammy White was injured for a handful of games, and she's back, and that kind of fortifies the Northwestern defense. But they've shown that they can be beat. Penn State had a really nice win against Northwestern and a comeback there. And, so I just think that, again, it's a game that is going to be super competitive. It's at Michigan. The winner gets the number 1 seed and the bye for the Big Ten tournament. The Big Ten tournament is being hosted by Northwestern. So there's a lot on the table here, and this is really going to impact seeding and potential seeding for the NCAA tournament as well. So great opportunity for Michigan, big game for Northwestern. And, I think it's interesting too, when you just look at schematically, and Matt, I was showing you some clips of Michigan defense against Hopkins. Tim McCormack spent 6 years coaching at Northwestern, has brought and evolved that 2 and 3 man offense to Hopkins. So for Michigan, getting last week to play against that right before playing against Northwestern is probably just a schedule blessing, because you have 2 back-to-back weeks where you're scouting and prepping for a lot of pick play and navigating those picks.
Yeah, and looking at, since Hannah Nielsen has been the coach at at Michigan, they have not beaten Northwestern. But last year, Northwestern did end Michigan's season May 14th. Northwestern won 8-7. So super close game there. I would expect another really close one. And quick shout out, both teams, they each have 3 players on the tour and watch list. Michigan, I believe, has a goalie, a defender, and an attacker. Northwestern has the 3 attackers, and the only other program in the country on the women's side with 3 top 25 semifinalists is Boston College. So I just wanted to point that out as well. So it should be a great weekend for college lacrosse as a whole, men's and women's side. There are a ton of other really big games, but just wanted to highlight really those 2 or 3 and dive into those. I think unless you guys have anything else that you would like to hit, I think we covered a lot here between recapped last night, gave our Tewaaraton takes, kind of ACC versus Ivy, talked some social media, previewed some games.
Yeah, I think this was good. Stephen, thank you for putting together the rundown. I think next time I would like to talk about that. I have some questions on that 2-man, 3-man game in women's lacrosse with the extra player that I think could be a good conversation. But one thing, and I can't even tell we're on YouTube if somebody's watching this or if people watch the recording or not. We've been doing this for about 6 or 7 weeks now. We do it because we like doing it and enjoy talking about it, but we hope that you do also. And so if you have feedback for us on topics you would like to talk about, if you want us to have guests on, we're just doing this because we like it. So please drop that in. We're going to keep evolving like we've been doing with all our content. This is just us starting something. So we would love to hear from you. We have our online community with Circle, our email list, our YouTube channel, our Instagram to subscribe to. So we're putting out content regularly, but it's always helpful to hear from our audience. So if you see this, if you're watching this live, if you watch the recording, please let us know.
You nailed the plugs there.
Had to plug it. Had to get the plugs.
And again, I'll throw in a shout out to Adam Lamberti, who did a great job on our deep dive this week on the flyby. The deep dive is a segment of our premium community that we're looking to continue to build, and he did a nice write up in there. So we previewed that in this week's Friday email. We send this Friday email out to over 10,000 men's and women's players, coaches, and families in the lacrosse community. So if you're not on that, make sure you join. You can find the links in our YouTube bios as well. And really appreciate everyone tuning in. Nice work today, guys.
Awesome.
Alrighty.
Good stuff.
Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Peace.
Peace. Right on the hour.